Louise from the Holistic Life Navigation, and thanks for joining me here today. I've been deeply touched and moved by your work, your courses, your content, everything that you, yeah, have brought forth and shared has deeply touched and moved and changed me, and kind of has also kind of informed some of how I'm with the people in the dark while they're here. And so
Mm.
yeah, delighted to be here with you.
I feel some tingles in here with that. Thank you. It's so nice to receive
Yeah.
that.
Yeah. Yeah, so um I mean so many places that could go, but I guess I just one of the things that we've been discovering here with people being in the dark. So I'll share a short thing and then I wanted to kind of ask you some questions around it. So we have these caves that we built that people come and they go in the dark. They're here for a day before they go in to just kind of weave in and out, settle into the space. And then there's a somatic based session that my other teammate Adrian does to kind of prepare people for the dark and kind of distill down what we've noticed over the years of what it's like, mostly in people's nervous systems when they go into the dark. And then they spend 3 days, 4 nights in the dark, and I'm up there with them every morning and evening, and we have a check in. And then they come out of the dark, and then there's another session to kind of help them digest what's maybe still stimulated in their nervous system, and also to really deepen into some of the things that they've come to really know in a new way in there. In the early years of doing the dark retreats, I come from a very kind of a very masculine, cold, spiritual orientation from 20 years of solitude and meditation. And so that was all I really knew when we first started holding the dark retreats. And so that was kind of the container that I held. There wasn't many check-ins. I mean, I would have never saw it that way at the time, but there was kind of an overlay of how it is and the kind of a healing, fixing, changing, transforming kind of overlay. And then Adrian came in, who has more of a feminine approach, trained in somatic therapy. And what would happen is people would come out of the dark, and I would tell her kind of what the experience was like for them, what I noticed, what they shared with me before she had their closing session. And she would come back time and time again and be like, that's actually not what was happening. Like there was so much going on in the background in their nervous system that they weren't even aware of. And so what we came to see, mostly what Adrian came to see and was able to bring me into, is that when people go into the dark initially, I'm sure as you can imagine, it's a threat to their nervous system. They're alone, they're there for an extended amount of time, and their defenses and their managing strategies come on really strong. And most people don't even notice that because they're in their safety strategies most of the time, protecting their system. And so as we began to see that, we dropped everything spiritual, no more spiritual orientation at all. And we began to take more of a somatic approach. And just silence my phone. And we started to more attune to where people were actually at, as opposed to giving them spiritual strategies to manage and control themselves, to stay above what was actually happening. And then all of a sudden, the dark retreat became an amazing opportunity or space for people to really start to see what was happening in their system, to really get honest with what was going on, when that support was there for people to just be honest, establish safety in their body, and kind of move from there. And one of the things that we started to notice is how much fawning, like a whole new perspective into fawning. Like that if people didn't have the permission to be overwhelmed, scared, anxious, ashamed about turning on the light or coming out and actually honoring their natural capacity and where they're at, that like they would just override the system and they would kind of, because there's that one person doing the check-in, they would kind of say, unknowingly say what they thought that person wanted them to hear so that they thought they were doing a good job.
Mm-hmm.
And as we started to shift to widen the scope to more like what's actually happening and bringing more honesty to the experience, people then all of a sudden were able to admit these hard truths that they maybe were never able to admit before. And so, one of my just wanted to open up and things that you can maybe unpack and share in there is like, yeah, what you've seen over the years with fawning in the context of like, one, in the context of how we perform in life, and not just, yeah, how we perform in terms of then how that has us feeling like a sense of belonging and a sense of safety, even though it's not a real sense of safety or a settled sense of safety. And, also on that thread, what was quite crushing for me, coming from the tradition that I had with years of meditation, and is I started to notice that the people who came with a lot of spiritual history and ideas and even like years of meditation and plant medicine and breath work and all of that, what was quite shocking was that those people had some of the hardest times in the dark. And the people who had none of that had an easier time being honest and thus had an easier time settling into the dark and dropping into these deeper levels in their body. And that was quite crushing for me because of how many years I spent in it. And then it totally turned my idea of spirituality on its head, because all of a sudden, like, it was like, whoa, is this just adding more concepts and more advanced tools for people to control and manage themselves, as opposed to just a more receptive awareness of actually being with what's here and this idea of how they should be, which then also kind of plays more into this fawning of like, even in spirituality, this performance or presentation of how we imagine we should be. And obviously, a lot of these people would never imagine that they're fawning or kind of, doing anything performative, but just how that sneaks in the background.
You just said two things that were important. I mean, a lot, but two things that are standing out. You said about controlling and managing, a strategy to control and manage. And for me, that's the real important thing, a strategy to control or a way to relate. And what I've experienced in a lot of spiritual practices, and I had the same kind of, the bottom fell out of my, platform of identity around spirituality. I had a lot of clients at one point that were deep into just different meditation and spiritual practices and devoted to certain teachers and groups. And they would spend 4 to 6 hours a day meditating. And these clients had the hardest time doing somatic practices in the room with me, because what their spiritual practices were doing were helping them control and manage sensation. It wasn't actually teaching them how to be with sensation. So it was still a residue of mind over matter philosophy, of mind controls matter, so mind dominates body. And I found that really fascinating and interesting, because spirit is not the body. We know this. It moves through the body. You can commune with it through the body, from the body, but it isn't the flesh and bone. So when I think of somatic practices compared to spiritual practices, the somatic ones are, what's it like to rest into the sensation and find a relationship with it, instead of how do I bypass it or try to manage the sensation, because you never really build capacity for discomfort. And so when you're saying that, it resonated with me, because that's been my personal experience and it's been my professional experience with different groups and demographics. And the people that tend more towards spiritual practices haven't developed a lot of capacity for sensation. And the spiritual practice is one way to even dissociate from the body. And in that dissociation, yes, you get a break from the body. That can be really powerful and important. But when the practice you're doing or the primary practice is just getting a break from the body, you're not learning how to be with it. So you bring in darkness. Darkness is an incredible deprivation of a sense of sight. And so all your other senses heighten, and your nervous system initially activates, and you can't orient visually. So everything comes down to a feeling place. So anything that's sitting in your body before even going into the darkness is now rising rapidly to the surface because you're so attuned to those other sensations. And this is the same thing I see with people who have insomnia. They spend all day working, living, watching TV, whatever it is they're doing. And then when they lay down at night, it's the first moment of the entire day they've deprived themselves of a sensation. Their eyes close, it's dark, it's more quiet because it's nighttime. And then all these pieces come up from the body to the surface that have been kind of waiting to be heard. So the work you do or what you offer, it's initiating them into that, but at a massive rate. So I'll drop that there and see where you go with that.
Is some of the people who have come who have been like therapists in some way, like even taking spirituality out of it, for some, there's like a background like fixing, changing, and healing. Like the work that therapists or healers do is to fix, change, and heal, and how that becomes also another trap in and of itself, where there is a kind of like a different mechanism to manage the self. Whether like where we learn tools in somatic work to settle in a sense of safety, to be with discomfort, but how does that become another mechanism, kind of another patterned mechanism of managing oneself? And just curious of your thoughts and experiences in that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's what propelled me out of the field of nutrition and coaching into somatic psychology, because I had been working. I initially was training to become a psychologist, and I discontinued that education because I didn't like the DSM. I didn't like that questioning childhood experiences and how that turned into behaviors was at the time controversial, and people didn't believe in that. It was about identifying a person based on behavior, giving them that identity, and then giving them proper medical treatment. And it wasn't holistic enough, so I went into nutrition to address the underlying cause of emotion that food can help support in the body. But as a nutritionist about a decade working with people one-on-one, it was still the same kind of game that I found myself getting into, of people coming in to fix, change, heal. I want to get rid of my rash. I want to lose 20 pounds. I don't want to have cancer. And I would go into this relationship with them of, okay, let's get rid of this thing, right? Let's apply food and herbs and holistic approaches and supplements. Let's apply all this to get rid of the state that you don't want to be in, understandably, by the way. And the whole process was a strategy to get rid of something. And there was no relating to the thing simultaneously or beforehand or even after. So it created these real conditional experiences of I'm good when the rash is gone, and then I eat something or stress comes up, the rash comes back, I'm bad. And they kept going into these kind of binaries of self-worth and how well they were doing or how pure or clean they were based on what their body was showing them. And I'm using a rash, for example, because I did a lot of skin disorders. I worked with a lot of skin disorders. And so what interested me was, well, what if we started relating to the rash? What if instead of initially trying to think, let me eat this perfectly to get rid of it, what if I had a relationship with it? Because the eating in this case, it wasn't propelled by desire or personal cultural transformation. It was from a deep, let's say, requirement for the individual to like themselves only if they were a certain way. So they weren't deeply enjoying the food they were eating. They weren't deeply enjoying the herbs. They were kind of pushing through it in hopes it would get rid of the rash. So nothing was really relational. And when you were saying fix, change, heal, what I was really hearing was transform. And I think we're always looking for transformation. And healing sounds like the cutting off of something or something ending. And it's why I say trauma or stress recovery. I don't say trauma and stress healing anymore, because recovery is this spiral experience of recovering from a state, so getting balanced after, let's say, an imbalance. But I'm saying all this because just like you're talking about therapy or coaches or even types of therapy like CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy approaches, so much is about how do we get rid of a behavior or a state or something in my body I don't want, instead of what if I relate to it, and then when I'm no longer hating this thing, what happens then? And what I keep finding is when people relate to these sensations or these behaviors of theirs or a skin rash or whatever it is they're going through, and they get to this settled place of their own personal relationship to the thing, then from there comes this kind of very natural transformation of living from that new relationship with said thing. So they might still do a dietary change. They might still go into therapy. They might still do the same techniques and practices, but it's from a much more settled place. It's not from a place of urgency. So it actually takes roots into their lives. It becomes like a personal culture instead of a very finite temporary strategy in hopes to get rid of something. If that makes sense.
I mean, in short, I fell into that, as I said, that category. I mean, I was on some level in freeze and had absolutely no idea. I mean, I spent my first three dark retreats of 10 days in freeze in the dark and had no idea, mistaking it for a deep spiritual state of being
Yes.
quiet because I was really good at controlling my mind. So my mind was quiet. And within a lot of those spiritual contexts, it's somehow it writes off anger, fear, like negative emotions are negative emotions. And so if you're not feeling them, there's some level of being spiritually advanced, which was totally how I felt for a very long time. And it took a lot for me to come to see that what I was doing or what was happening. I mean, and sometimes it took actually witnessing with Adrian's support, seeing other people in the dark and them having the same experience. I mean, it happens sometimes here where somebody goes into freeze in the dark and they'll actually be telling me during the check-in how good they're doing and how relaxed they are and calm and happy. I mean, now I can sense what's actually going on in the backdrop because of how we've tracked what fight, flight, and freeze looks like in the dark. Obviously, it's pretty limited how people can manage themselves in there, and so it takes on certain really clear forms. Whereas, like when someone's going into freeze in the dark, they tend to not really leave the bed and they feel safe in the bed. But when they go to walk around the dark, they feel a little bit uneasy. And that was me in the early days, but I kind of did something funny and was just like, well, I feel safe in the bed. Of course, I don't feel comfortable in the dark. It's dark and kind of eerie, and so I'll just stay in the bed, and I never thought more about it. But then witnessing all these different people go through and just seeing through that lens of what was actually happening in the nervous system and how there's so much in us to not admit that we're afraid or overwhelmed, and how so much of the, not everyone, but more often than not, people who are spiritually oriented, especially men, to even add another layer, are so much less likely or even able to admit that they're afraid. And I mean, it was completely earth shattering for me to see in myself and see in others how, like, that was actually the doorway. And that in the early days, if somebody asked me, were people afraid and scared when they go into the dark? Do they experience fear? I would have said not many people. And in the early days, I would have kind of saw that the people who weren't experiencing fear were on some level stronger. That was definitely my
Yeah.
lens back then. I mean, but now it's completely flipped, and it's those who can actually admit that they're scared or overwhelmed that, like, that's when it actually really opens up in there for someone to actually settle into the threat that's in the background that they can't even touch. And it's been amazing to see how fawning it is such a plays into it all. And where, we've it's been a fine line that we've ridden of like, is going into the dark good for people? And because of what happens, I mean, now we've really refined and evolved our support to a space where it's like, we do encourage people to come out, to turn on the light. Like, that is totally part of the experience of really supporting people into just being honest and following what's true for them. But that's not always going to be the case when someone goes into the dark with a level of support that's maybe spiritually oriented or oriented in healing or fixing or changing, where all of a sudden somebody just being like, I'm scared, and us and someone being like, that's okay. What's it like to be scared? But for someone to even have the permission to say that, like, yeah, it's just been an amazing window into how powerful fawning really is, and how on some level everyone has it. I mean, the adaptive quality of blending with your culture to fit in. But like, how does fawning, in a way that everyone has fawning, create limitations of what somebody's able to be honest with?
Well, what's interesting about fawning is it's a hybrid. So you have the freeze response and then you have a performance. Whereas without fawning, you just have the freeze response. So you just have constriction and override and some numbness and dissociation, immobility. And what makes fawning interesting is it has both aspects where the way you really feel, your body tenses and constricts and overrides that expression, and then an incongruent opposite expression emerges. That's what specifically makes something fawning. So people will think if you go to a party and you're charming someone, you're fawning. Not necessarily if you mean it. It's not how you do it. It's not even what you do. It's, is it actually congruent to what you feel? And so when you're talking about this experience with fawning, absolutely makes sense in the spiritual community. When you walk in with this value of, if I can override my fear, I've done something good. I'm advanced, I'm enlightened, I'm doing my work. And you come out riddled with fear, but in a freeze response, and then you're saying, it was amazing, I feel so alive, there was nothing, I had no fear. That part that's talking, that's the fawning. It's trying to secure its attachment to the people around you that think, well, you're amazing now, so you belong. And that sense of belonging is so rich for the animal body. Just like you said about fitting in with culture, like a school of fish. The one fish that stands out is the one that gets eaten by the predator. When they're all moving together in that big, beautiful shape, it's like a creature that is protected, and protecting each other with all the bodies. So these animal bodies, these nervous systems, when we're fawning and we're matching the people around us, there's this deep sense of protection and safety and belonging. However, what you're pointing to, I think, is if you're overriding and you're in freeze, and especially when you're in fawn, you're mistaking all of all your situations you're going through that actually are very unpleasant, you're mistaking as something pleasant. And this is what I would see a lot, and do see a lot, with people who socially fawn. They go out to eat or to tea, or they hang out with a friend. Their body is exhausted. They're not enjoying the conversation. They're not enjoying their time. Yet they're smiling, they're laughing, they're leaning in more. And they leave with this cognitive story of, I love that person. I love hanging out with that person. What a great night I had. And they tell people, we had such a great night at the movies. Yet the body is screaming, saying, I don't want to see that person. I don't want to do this. So what we're reporting, what we're saying, is incongruent with how the body's actually holding it. But people don't know that until they embody the fawn response. Just like freeze, and freeze and collapse is the other one. That's when the immobility comes from having no energy to move. It's a very limp state. But a lot of people will do spiritual work, plant medicine, breath work, a lot of cathartic, big work, primal screaming, all this. And they'll go into a state of dissociation, and they mistaken the dissociation for a massive release of trauma. And what's actually happening, they're getting re-traumatized.
I mean, I'm like a classic grand example of that. I mean, I spent over the course of like 7 years, I spent 2 or 3 years alone in solitude, meditating, screaming, chanting. Like, I really got into Osho's cathartic practices. I mean, and some people who saw me during those times, in those moments, were like, whoa, this is one of the most ecstatic people I've ever seen. I mean, and I got really good at like singing myself into an ecstasy for hours. And I would never have believed anyone that I was in freeze. I was like, I'm feeling so much in my body. Like, and there's so much joy, and there was, but it was an overriding. And like, I was uncomfortable. I mean, I ran it through funny lenses in my head of like writing off the world as just kind of stupid or, not spiritually evolved. And so I was feeling uncomfortable in that. And so I was really good at overriding, but not actually any kind of receptive awareness, but was completely unable yet to see that at that time.
Yeah. And that's what is really common with these experiences. When I'm doing a workshop or a retreat somewhere and I do a demo with somebody in front of the room, they come up and I say, "How are you?" And they said, "I'm good." And I'll say, "What tells you you're good?" And they pause and they look and they go, "Actually, I'm terrified to be in front of people." And I'll say, "Okay, so are you comfortable with our seating?" "Yep, I'm fine." "What tells you you're fine?" And they take a breath and they notice and they go, "Actually, can you move back?" So there's like this reflexive desire to fawn and perform like goodness or wellness, or I'm happy or I'm settled or I'm comfortable, without actually pausing to see, well, what tells me that? Is this a projection of mind, or is this actually a real expression of a state I feel? And that's the main difference between somatic and cognitive, is I can tell you how fine I am when you ask me. We do that reflexively. But if I pause to actually feel what my body's doing or feeling or holding, the state has so much to express then. And so I'm appreciating that you're shifting the way you're doing this work. Because if people are going in a cognitive spiritual approach to darkness and massive sensory deprivation, they're not being encouraged to actually feel what the body's going through. They're having an expectation of what they should do, like it's a test that they could pass or fail. When really it's more of an experiment. It's like, what does my body do when I get in here?
The experiment, and I'd say that's more of how we hold it, where it is an experiment, which then gives, yeah, the permission for people to step out, to turn on the light, to actually admit that they're scared or overwhelmed or whatever that may be. And it's amazing how, I mean, I'd say 90% of the time, if not more, when I go up, everyone's telling me how fine they are, how good they are. I mean, and even describe like I'm relaxed and calm, and it's like on, and within a minute of just a little somatic exploration, they're like, "Well, my belly just released, or my shoulders dropped. Like I thought I was relaxed." And seeing that over and over again, which I'm sure you see in your work, is really, I don't know, it's quite striking to like the disconnect that so many of us live in, and not even aware of it.
As you're saying it, I'm
And
seeing you on the chair. And
uh
it's one of my favorite things is, and anyone listening can check this, most of us are being held by something right now, whether it's the ground or the car or the chair. And is your body even noticing? Is the body like pulled up away from it? Or is it actually leaning and softening, just kind of letting the body have this thing that holds it? It's a great kind of first practice for a lot of people.
I mean, and that's something that I definitely gleaned from your course. And like one of the things now that I'll do with people when they're in the dark is invite them to come to the door and let their lean against the door, and then I'm on the other side of the door, so we have as much closeness as we can with them still being in their space, and let their head be back and just starting to feel the support of what's holding them. And it's been, I mean, that in and of itself has been such an amazing practice of really, of having people start to settle and feel safe in the space. And one kind of, yeah, I mean, one totally unique thing as we've approached it more of as an experiment and an exploration is there was one person, and this was maybe 8 months ago, and I'd never noticed it after years, and she was in the dark and she was super settled and relaxed. And then she mentioned something about coming out and opening her eyes and how that was going to feel overwhelming. And I asked her, what's it like when you open your eyes? And she did. And she was like, whoa, my whole body just contracted. And I was shocked because she had just a moment ago was like in her body, she was settled and feeling safe. And I was like, whoa, I wonder if is that happening for everyone? And then so moving forward from there, I'd say about 95% of the time, people are unknowingly clenching their eyes in the dark. And so we'll do these somatic explorations, and once it really feels like to me someone's genuinely settled in their body, and they can tell me how they know that they feel safe and calm and settled, and they're connected, and I invite them to open their eyes, almost every time their body then contracts. And then we'll pendulate with eyes open and closed and have a little exploration there. And that's kind of the moment for many where they're like actually in the space and not kind of dissociating from their external environment because of how scary it is, which has been an interesting bridge into almost meditation in some way, where there's almost like, I mean, for me, when I would reflect on it, there's almost like an insulating in my interior through controlling and not having any idea that that was happening. And when I'd invite people to open their eyes, they were always shocked where all of a sudden they would just contract immediately. And then just witnessing what happens when we'd pendulate from eyes open and closed to a point where eventually they would feel that same felt sense of safety with their eyes open. And then there was this whole other thing that opens up because now they're able to actually feel the darkness in their body. And it's like this vast, infinite, open space, which has them accessing new qualities in their body that they didn't have access to before.
Even when you say that, I get this great image of the merging of the nervous system to its environment. It's like when there's all this darkness, and darkness is very spacious. It's infinite as far as we know. You know, when we open our eyes and see nothing, there's no boundary, and that's what's so scary. And so that mystery and having no end in sight is quite big for the body. And a lot of people who have trauma or have chronic stress, the body is in a chronic state of tension, and it has come to see tension as protection and safety. So when you're suddenly met with massive expansiveness, the body will then recoil and tense even more, you know, in response to that. And so I love how you said, and then eventually the body opens up and it's filled with the darkness of the space that it's in its own body, that the dark space of the body opens to meet the dark space that it's in. And there's something really gorgeous about that. And it's why, you know, you can have psychedelic experiences without a drop of a substance, because the body shapeshifts based on its environment, but it can't do that if it's always tense, because tension is protection. So it's a wall cutting you off from where you are. It's a pulling back, a bracing, you know, a recoil. And to me, it's such a psychedelic experience to lay against a tree and slowly feel my tension dissipate and feel all the things I start merging with in that landscape. It's incredible. And so you saying this is an important reminder that this kind of somatic work, especially the way I teach it, and it sounds like the way you teach and hold it, it's really as simple as scanning for tension and softness. It comes down to those two states and sensations. Because without that ability, and especially when you come from tension, when the body has chronically been tense, you know, since you can remember throughout development, you don't really know a difference. So you've developed in a dissociative state. So the first step is just even getting people to feel the body, and then they can assess, oh, am I actually bracing or am I here in this experience?
It's amazing how, yeah, just the simplicity of this is just not something that is kind of part of just what people know, how we orient, how we and how, again, I mean, I bring it back to spirituality because that's been one of the most just kind of crushing things for me, and just what it's turned on its head. And to also see that some of the people who have dropped in the deepest here have never meditated a day in their life. I mean, there was one in kind of the early days, there was someone who came straight off of Wall Street, and he's just like, I don't like meditating. I don't like the idea of controlling my mind. And like, in that time, I was like, whoa, okay, we'll see how this goes. But he had honesty, and he had receptivity, and he was available, and he went into the dark, and he dropped into the most profound spiritual states. He was in stillness for hours in his body, just crying from how beautiful it was.
Mm,
And it
mm.
completely just blew my mind of like what, in a way, like what happened to spirituality? Was it always like that? Was it like, I mean, I know most of spirituality is very male oriented and dominated. And so there's a sense of control, there's a sense of achieving spirituality and progressing. And when people really drop into the dark, and I know you've shared that a lot of the people who do the work with you are more women than men, more often than not, that like the women have more access, more easy access in the dark, like that natural movement of receptivity, availability, willing to admit that they're scared over a man that's going to have a lot harder time being vulnerable in that way.
I'm appreciating the masculine and feminine pieces because I once read a book called Sexual Persona from a woman named Camille Paglia. She's a very controversial woman, but she's brilliant. And one thing she talks about is how women sexually develop on the inside. You know, in a way, men's sexual organs develop on the outside. So
Mm.
throughout sexual development and puberty, there's for women there's this initiation into felt sense, in literally feeling something inside of you transform, but you don't see it. Besides blood coming out, you don't see what's happening. Your whole life force and sexual energy is somewhat of a mystery because it's so internal. So there's this development of mystery that a lot of women are naturally initiated into. And what's fascinating about men is with that development of the sexual organs on the outside and watching the growth and watching the transformation, the erection, like seeing something point out into the world. The masculine energy is a propellant. It's almost like, let's go figure out this mystery. Let's go dominate mystery, or let's tame mystery. And it's these
Mm.
interesting two forces of, no, let's leave the mystery untamed and let's tame it. Together, there's great balance when you pendulate. And I think of myself as an intersex man. I got a little taste of both of those. So I could feel what it's like to develop with complete confusion and mystery and not knowing what's going on inside of me. And then to have these certain male masculine attributes as more testosterone entered my body. And so I think it's an important piece because if you're used to working with a much more, you know, what I'm calling here a masculine energy, if that's how your body moves and your mind works, going into a dark cave, it's like going into a birth canal. You know, it's very yin, it's very feminine, it's very mysterious. And if you have a really, as you're saying, this masculinized spiritual practice, if that's been your orientation to control mystery, I mean, what's more mysterious than sensation in the body? So to control mystery, then it's going to be very hard to have a relationship to a mysterious dark space that you sit in.
Mm. Yeah. Could you say more about the mystery that develops in the feminine? That was yeah, that like how that's like innately internal, their relationship to the mystery, and how the masculine is controlling it. I just never really, yeah, saw it that way. Is there anything, yeah, more that you can unpack in that?
I just love the body so much. You know, the body teaches us so much about life. And there's something I love the binary, you know, which is so unpopular to say, but I love the male and I love the female body. And because I've had the convergence in my own, like I've explored both in myself and really enjoyed the diet and felt the differences hormonally and structurally. And so I'm saying that because women's bodies, it's all felt sense and trust. It's even giving birth and being pregnant. It's all happening inside of them. They have to feel all of that process. It all happens in the dark. And so there's just this kind of, when I say initiation, the actual biology of being female is an initiation into I feel things that aren't seen. And I think it's why women are so great at kind of like sniffing out almost in a psychic way emotions and thoughts and belief systems that men aren't usually as good as sniffing out. Now, I really believe any sex can invoke the feminine or masculine. I don't think masculine is bound to male. I think testosterone and estrogen are these interesting hormones and powerful creatures that amplify masculinity and femininity, for sure. However, any sex can invoke the masculine or feminine. And so men that I know who have invoked the feminine, either by initiation, experiences that have happened in their lives, they have no choice, or consciously, they also gain a bit of that intensity of they're sitting in front of someone and they can feel the person wanting to cry but not. Like it's this trust of what I feel instead of what I see or know. And I find that to be particularly female and feminine. And I think that's why I attract so many women and even feminine men or men that work with the feminine more or the yin energies more because that's how I grew up. I grew up very feminine.
Hmm. Yeah, I love that. I mean, that's what we see here all the time. Whether it's a male or a female, when somebody really drops in the dark, they come into their feminine. There's just like, there's nothing to conquer, there's nothing to achieve, there's nothing to control. And when people do, they're just all bound up. And however they're handling that bound up, they're usually not even aware that they're bound up. But like when people really drop in, they drop into, they're receptive to the mystery in there. And it brings them into completely new terrain and it transforms them at a fundamental level because of the way that they're relating to whatever's here. And yeah, it's amazing. And that's where it's really turned my idea of spirituality on its head because most of spirituality is male led. Most of the big spiritual teachers are men. And maybe that's a thing how the masculine is propelled into the world to, bring things, and that tends to not be a quality of the feminine. But how much gets lost then in that because of, that mystery that the feminine carries and the receptivity. Um, yeah, it's such
I
an
appreciate you
interesting.
saying that. I'm sorry to cut you off. I appreciate you saying that. Just because when you're talking about most spiritual practices and kind of movements are male led, there is that propellant nature of testosterone to go out and dominate. That is natural. That's what testosterone does, and it serves beautiful purposes. I don't want to paint the picture of the masculine being only this horrible dominant, creature. That's just part of the equation, and the pendulation between feminine and masculine brings so much balance. Um, and when I think of the teachers I have learned from who were women, the ones that are not in their masculine, but they're really women deep in their feminine, loving their feminine, they're the ones that taught me about mystery. Like they're the ones that taught me you don't have to know why, Luis. They're the ones that say it's okay to fall apart in bed for a few days. The
Mm.
men I have learned from, there tends that are more masculine men, what I tend to always hear is master your mind so you can master your life. There's like this interesting kind of capitalistic progress idea of we're applying spiritual practices so I can be a hell of an entrepreneur and make six figures. And so I just think it's interesting, even the outcomes of why does a woman or someone that working with the feminine do this work, and why does someone who's working with the masculine do this work? And I think that's really an important distinction.
Totally. Yeah, it's definitely had me paused a lot, like as I witness when people really drop in the dark. Like there is in that space, there's nothing that's gonna move them to like go disseminate what they've got. There's also not like
Mm-hmm.
there's not like how much of that, I mean, is the masculine moving in that way and like a sense of the masculine needing to feel self-important in the world. I mean, the feminine's going to have that too, but it's like, right, I think the biology is more like that sense of nurture and like it may complete that loop for the feminine. Whereas the masculine, I mean, I think that sense of nurture does complete the loop, but I don't know. Does I mean, it does in the dark. I could certainly see it, and I'm sure it does in many circumstances, but is it our culture? I mean, but I guess is it, I guess it is the biology of the man to go out. Um,
I think it's exactly that. I think it's biology. I think every culture has this ability because of the biology. The difference is, has the culture integrated the two, or does the culture prefer one over the other, or value one over the other? And people a lot of times call our culture, Western culture, patriarchal. And I think why they say that, and when you think of an actual patriarchy, I do not believe we are one. When I think of what we value and where we come from and what we think is important and priority, I think it is more masculine led than it is female or feminine led. And why I say I don't believe we're patriarchy is because our laws are not against women like they used to be. There was a time where it was actually like a legal patriarchy. It's not the case anymore. But the residue is still there in terms of even women can feel the urge to be masculine like men and dominate. And so to me, that's why it comes down to the biology and it comes down to the force you're working with. How I had this amazing experience with a group of 50 women, and we were talking about femininity and the somatics of the feminine energy. Not even of being female, but the somatics of the feminine. And I was shocked to hear how many women in the room said how much they hate the feminine and how much they hate it in themselves and how they think it's weak and how they judge it and how they think it's the only option is to be dominated or oppressed. So there's these massive overcouplings with the feminine, even with women, because of how they've been treated. Not just they're not just making it up. They've come from lineages of being mistreated for being women. And having the yin role of tending in the house and having more of a mysterious role in society, not as much of a public role, and how that eventually got used against them. But I think at our core, as like biological binary beings, if I think of indigenous tribes, at our core, I think the most incredible balance is when both were held, like the matriarch and the patriarch were equally important, and they were actually counseling each other for balance.
mhm. Yeah. Yeah, culture is such a fascinating thing of how it shapes us and how we like and witnessing people in the dark in that vein of how what it gives us access to or what we're available for based on, I mean, our upbringing and all of that, but also just the culture that we come into. And I see over and over again when people enter into the dark, especially men who like for the first time ever start to come into a feminine orientation because it's never been presented as valuable or meaningful. Like it's
That's
never
right.
had any like why? I mean, there is some to like to connect and feel your emotions, but beyond that, which has been the interesting piece in there, is like everyone has to pass through in the dark some kind of membrane of like admitting that they're afraid and
Hmm.
actually like being okay that they're afraid. Like this morning when I was up there with somebody who's in the dark, who's another person who blows my mind, not spiritually oriented at all, just a high level entrepreneur for whatever reason has a like right in the background there is a receptivity and a willingness, but no spiritual striving. So there's not this kind of
Hmm. Hmm.
which I never would have thought would actually have been a hindrance, but and sometimes when that's there for people, we tend to like open that up because there is a sincerity that knows that there's something more. but it's so jumbled with a sense of trying to kind of create that sense of what it looks like, which is a very grand, masculine, in control, and powerful thing. And as he's been dropping, this morning even he was like so softening and opening, and he's like, "Whoa, it's scary to be so vulnerable."
Mm-hmm.
And I know in my own system that like vulnerability initially and still has threads of it feels weak and disgusting
That's right.
in me, and how without either being in a situation or being with somebody that would stay with me in that, I don't think I'd ever begin to lean into vulnerability because my system presents as disgusting and weak. And it's like, why would I move into something that feels disgusting and weak?
When you're exemplifying overcouplings perfectly right there.
Mm.
Because when we talk about a patriarchal or a hypermasculine or a sexist culture or experience, that's exactly how it starts. It's like if men decide that their feminine attributes or the energy of femininity or a feminine posture or whatever it is weak and disgusting, right? Because vulnerability is overcoupled with weak and disgusting. Then how do we treat women? You know, how do we treat the feminine? How do we treat men who are gay or men who deviate from a masculine standard? It all becomes this hyper masculine experience because letting the feminine flow through your body as a man is so important to balance out all the energy it takes to also let masculinity flow through the body. And when you said we don't value it, like it's not valued for men to just sit back and lay in the dark and get vulnerable. It's like, well, what's that going to do for anybody? That's what's so interesting to me, because I get the privilege when I do my men's groups to see a bunch of men lay down in their beds on screens together, you know, on like a grid on Zoom while we play music. And it's so touching to see all these grown men holding pillows, laying on their side, laying on the floor together. And so many men will tell us, I've never seen another guy just lay down. That's never happened in my life. We're always sitting up and sizing each other up and competing and trying to be the one that's more powerful or dominant. And this kind of collective, let's all just let it go for a moment. It's so nourishing for them. But the word value is important to me. We have to find value in that to keep invoking it.
Mm. Yeah. And I think that's where going into the dark is kind of a unique thing because people who go into the dark, who come here, have something in them where they're like, they like to do hard things. I mean, because it's going to be, and like, so in their mind, they have the idea of how they typically do hard things, which is going to for most people, is in their masculine, because that's how we do
Hmm.
hard things in life. And so they come with that orientation, and all of a sudden, we kind of present a completely counterintuitive way of doing something hard, which is just like admitting defeat and that you're scared and overwhelmed, but that doesn't like, how could that actually be a way through to do something hard? And it's amazing to see that structure deconstruct in there, not for everyone, but for many, where all of a sudden there's like, I mean, where it's almost like, in this regard at least, like the feminine in a very unintentional way is more powerful than the masculine, which
So
is
powerful. Yeah.
which just totally blown my mind, especially from a spiritual orientation and a male orientation, that like, whoa, the man and the spiritual orientation is actually not as, I mean, strong is a kind of funny word to use, but is not as strong as just this open, receptive, feminine orientation, which, yeah, is so counter to our culture. I mean, it's almost counter to most countercultures too.
It certainly is. And I think when you're saying stronger, what I hear and feel is it's more expansive. It's kind of infinite.
Mm.
And even biologically accurate, the masculine comes from the feminine. Like women birth men. So it all starts in that place. And I think that's what makes it so incredibly powerful is like everything's in there. Everything is in that dark feminine mystery. The universe is the dark feminine mystery. And so the sun, as crazy powerful as the sun is this dot in the infinite mystery of the feminine black space. So it's absolutely infinitely powerful. I think that's why it's you're saying more powerful, because there's an infinite
Right.
power there. Where
Right.
masculine
I
has a
guess.
finite power, we do burn out.
Right. It's almost like the feminine precedes the masculine.
That's exactly my experience. Yeah.
Yeah. It's amazing. Well, thanks, Louise. It's really been sweet getting to rap with you here.
Oh yeah, this was lovely. I feel like I've been in
Yeah.
a bathtub, just kind of chilling out with you under the forest canopy.
A bathtub. You know that there we have hot baths in the dark, and I
Oh,
mean
do
I
you?
hear. Yeah, that's like the one of the safe places for people. And I mean, so many men all the time, they're like, I never take a bath. Like, that's just not. And then so many men, they're like, whoa, I understand my wife now. Like, why she takes
Mm.
baths. I never got it, but now I understand about the bath.
I am such a bath taker. So
Uh,
the moment you said you have hot bath in the dark, I just thought, what an incredible initiation into the feminine. A hot womb to lay in the dark. I mean, that sounds incredible.
yeah. Yeah.
Mm.
Well, hopefully, one of these days you'll make it out here.
Certainly will.
Yeah. Great. Well, thanks for your time, Louise. It's been real sweet being
Thank
here
you, my
with you.
friend. It was really
Yeah.
good to be with you. Have a beautiful day.
Yeah. Hey, you too.